Thank you for joining me today on the podcast, Conversations with Ray Martinez. We're going to be talking about when God says no. You know, they say that there's three answers that God gives to prayers. It's usually no, yes, or wait. Well, today we're going to talk about the no answer. The Bible really addresses this concept of God saying no to people's requests in various passages. These instances can provide insight into why and how God might refuse a request or a prayer. Here are some notable examples. King David and the temple. If you take a look at 1Chronicles 28 verses 2 through 3, King David wanted to build a temple for God, but God said no, explaining that David had been a man of war and he shed much blood. Instead of God chose David's son, Solomon, to build the temple, who, as you well know, was a man of great wisdom. And then there's the example of Paul's thorn in the flesh. We're familiar with that. If you look at 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 9, the Apostle Paul asked God 3 times to remove a thorn in the flesh, particularly suffering of affliction. God said no, explaining that his grace was sufficient for Paul, and that his power was made perfect in weakness. So Paul kind of got a good answer. It wasn't the way he wanted it to go, but he got his answer and Paul was satisfied with it. If you remember later on in Scripture, he says, when I am weak, then I am strong. And it's because he's relying on God. Moses didn't enter the promised land. There was another no. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 23 through 27, Moses pleads with God to allow him to enter the promised land, but God refused, stating that Moses could view the land from a distance, but wouldn't enter it due to a previous act of disobedience. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you look at Matthew 26, verse 36 through 46, Jesus prayed to God, the Father, asking if it was possible to avoid the suffering of the crucifixion. However, he also submitted to God's will, saying, not as I will, but as you will. God's answer was no, and Jesus went on to fulfill his sacrificial role. The Israelites wanted a king. 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 through 9. This is an interesting case. The Israelites asked for a king to rule over them like other nations because God had been ruling over them, and I guess they didn't think that was good enough. I don't know how much better you get, but God said no initially, explaining through Samuel that they were rejecting him as their king. So God felt rejected by them. Despite the warning about the negative consequences which they endured, God eventually allowed them to have a king, starting with Saul. So these examples really illustrate that God's refusal can be due to a variety of reasons, including his greater plans, the need for personal growth or discipline, and the alignment of requests with his will and purposes. The Bible provides good reasons why God might say no to a person's request or prayer. Here are some key reasons, along with corresponding biblical references that I'm going to provide you. There's that God's sovereign will. God's overreaching plan and will are often beyond human understanding. He may say no because a request does not align with his greater purpose. Remember, the example is that Jesus in Gethsemane, and the reference was Matthew 26, verse 39. Of course, as you know, this is Jesus asking for God to take this cup away from him if this was possible. The second reason may be for our spiritual growth. God may say no to help believers grow in their faith, and their patience, and their reliance on him. Paul's thorn in the flesh, again, this is what was happening. He wanted to make Paul a stronger man. It was meant to keep him humble and dependent on God's grace. God's refusal was to ensure Paul's spiritual maturity. And the third reason is protection from harm. Sometimes God says no to protect us from potential harm or adverse consequences, even though we don't see it. There's things that he sees obviously way ahead of us. The Israelites were asking for this king, as we talked about a minute ago, but God warned Israel through Samuel about this negative consequence of having a king. Though eventually he allowed it, his initial refusal was to protect them from the hardships a king would bring. And you know the rest of the story. Saul ended up being dethroned. King David comes into play. And there's always troubles with their kings that they have because it's their human nature. God's ways are perfect. And then there's this thing about sin and disobedience. Sin and disobedience can result in God saying no to our requests. Moses not entering the promised land was because of his sin. Moses was denied, but yet he wanted to be able to see the promised land, and God allowed him to do that, but he had to face the consequences. And then timing. That's our fifth takeaway. Timing is important. God's timing is perfect, and sometimes his no is not a denial, but a delay for a better time. Abraham and Sarah's child are a great reference to this. If you look at Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 through 19, Abraham and Sarah waited many years for the fulfillment of God's promise of a son. The delay was part of God's perfect timing to fulfill his covenant. And then there's the sixth point, and that's for a greater good. God might say no to achieve a greater good that aligns with his purpose. Joseph's imprisonment. Look at Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Joseph's wrongful imprisonment was part of God's plan to place him in a position to save many people during a famine, demonstrating a greater good through temporary suffering. Remember what that verse says? Oh no, what you intended bad, God made good. That's what Joseph told his brothers because they were worried he was going to kill them to get even. Here's the seventh point. It's to teach dependence and trust. By saying no, God teaches his followers to trust him and depend on his wisdom and provisions. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness. Look at Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 through 3. God allowed the Israelites to experience hunger and hardship in the wilderness to teach them dependence on him and to trust in his provisions. And then the eighth reason can be for the lack of faith or wrong motives. Prayer with wrong motives or lack of faith, they may lead to God's refusal. James 4:3 teaches us that when people ask with the selfish motives, God does not grant the request because they are not aligned with his will. I remember one time a person praying and asking that God would provide them a baggie of marijuana. Now, that doesn't even sound normal, does it? But that's how people get it wrong sometimes. Here's another one. It's testing and refining. God may say no as a means of testing and refining a person's character and their faith. Look at Job's suffering. Take a look at Job 23, verse 10. Job's trials were a test of his faith and integrity, leading to a deeper understanding of God and ultimately greater blessings. These reasons they underscore the complexity of God's interactions with humanity. His denials are often rooted in love, wisdom, and a desire for the ultimate good of his people. I want to reflect a little bit more about Sarah and Abraham. This has always baffled me as to why God would wait so long for Sarah to have a child. The story of Sarah having a baby late in life, as recorded in the Bible, serves multiple purposes and provides a profound lesson about faith, God's promises, and his sovereign timing. Here are several reasons why God waited for Sarah to have a baby so late in life. To demonstrate God's power and sovereignty. God's timing in allowing Sarah to conceive at an advanced age underscores his omnipotence. It illustrates that God can fulfill his promises regardless of natural limitations. In Genesis 18, verses 10 through 14, when God announced that Sarah would have a son, she was well past the age of childbearing. Sarah laughed, but God responded, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This statement really highlights God's ability to perform miracles and his control over the natural world. And then here's a second point. To test and strengthen Abraham and Sarah's faith. The long wait for this promised child served as a test for faith from Abraham and Sarah. Their story demonstrates the importance of trusting in God's promises even when circumstances seem impossible. We've all come across that, right? We've had circumstances we thought, okay, this is doomsday. This is it. Take a look at Hebrews 11, verse 11 through 12. By faith, Sarah received power to conceive even when she was past the age because she considered him faithful who had promised. Their faith was refined and strengthened through the waiting period. To set a precedent for future generations, this is important. This is my third point. The miraculous birth of Isaac set a precedent for future acts of God's intervention and faithfulness. It establishes a pattern of God working through seemingly impossible situations to fulfill His promises. For your reference, you can read Romans 4, verses 18 through 21. Abraham's faith is highlighted as a model for believers, showing that faith involves trusting God's promises against all odds. Here's my fourth point. To highlight the importance of God's timing. God's timing is perfect and often beyond human understanding. The delay in Sarah's conception emphasized that God's plans unfold according to His divine schedule, not human expectations. And we have a lot of human expectations, don't we? And we want God to meet our human expectations, but God knows how to work around those issues. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1 teaches us that for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. That's important. For every matter. That means like everything. This principle is reflecting on the timing of Isaac's birth. To show the fulfillment of God's covenant, that's the fifth point. God's covenant with Abraham included the promise of numerous descendants and a great nation. The birth of Isaac was a crucial step in the unfolding of his covenant, demonstrating God's faithfulness in keeping His promises. In Genesis 17, verse 19, God specifically promised Abraham that Sarah would bear a son and he would establish His covenant with Isaac and his descendants. Here's the sixth point. To serve as a typological foreshadowing. The miraculous birth of Isaac serves as a typological foreshadowing of the birth of Jesus Christ. Both births were announced by God. Both involved elements of the miraculous, and both children were key to God's redemptive plan. Take a look at Galatians 4, verses 22 through 23 and verse 28. Paul uses the birth of Isaac to illustrate the concept of being children of promises, linking it to the miraculous birth of Jesus and the new covenant. Here's my seventh point, and my last point. To teach patience and dependence on God. The long wait for Isaac's birth taught Abraham and Sarah, as well as future believers, about the importance of patience and complete dependence on God's timing and provision. If we take a look at James 1, verses 3 through 4, it talks about the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. The wait for Isaac was a period of maturation for Abraham and Sarah's faith. I'm going to bring up another point that I think is important to highlight human limitations and God's supernatural intervention. The advanced age of Sarah and Abraham really highlighted the limitations of human ability and the necessity of divine intervention. This contrast served to glorify God and make it clear that the fulfillment of His promises was due to His power alone. There was nothing else that could have intervened. It was God alone. If you take a look at Romans 4:19, Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body and Sarah's barren womb. This underscores that the fulfillment of the promise was entirely God's doing. In summary, God's delay in allowing Sarah to conceive was multifaceted, serving to display His power, test and strength of faith, establishing His covenant, and foreshadowing the future redemptive acts. It also provided a powerful lesson in the importance of patience, trust, and the acknowledgement of human limitations in light of God's sovereign capabilities. When God says no, it doesn't mean rejection. It means redirection. Trust that His plans for you are greater than you can imagine. I like what Lisa Turkos said. When God says no, we are sometimes tempted to believe it's because He doesn't love us. But the truth is, His no is often because He loves us too much to give us less than His best. Lisa is a well-known author and speaker and the president of the Proverbs 31 Ministries, a nonprofit organization aimed at leading women to engage in the Bible and growth in their faith. When we read the Bible, it's important to understand that the different books help teach us in different ways with different perspectives. So the Bible is chock full of ways of teaching us. You take, for example, the book of Matthew tells us what Jesus said. The book of Mark tells us what Jesus did. And the book of John tells us who Jesus is. And Dr. Luke tells us how Jesus feels. He gives us the humanity side of things because he's a doctor. So it's through these different dimensions of how the Bible tells us who Jesus really is. So when you read those books, understand the dimension that they're speaking from, and you'll come to know Christ in His full character by reading all 4 books because they have a different way of telling some of the same stories. I want you to have a blessed day, and may God be with you, and keep praying for our nation. This country is going through a lot of turmoil and a lot of violence. Only God can intervene, and His timing is perfect. You have a blessed day.